Hey guys, welcome to Film Darkly. I'm Anthony Paceno, and today I got another review for you. I went ahead and checked out the 2016 Japanese film Shin Godzilla. Now, if you're not familiar with the word Shin, Shin usually means true, so it's basically saying true Godzilla. Now, this movie, like I said, came out in 2016, and if you can recall, 2 years before this, America had their Godzilla film, directed by Gareth Edwards, which was in 2014. I felt this movie was made in response to that Godzilla film, and that's why it's called Shin Godzilla or True Godzilla, because it's a Japanese way of saying, hey, we got the real Godzilla. Now, I'm a big fan of Godzilla. I grew up with Godzilla films, so there's a lot of nostalgia for me when it comes to Godzilla, which is one of the reasons why, I flocked to the theater to watch Godzilla films and why I took a picture of Godzilla's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame because I like Godzilla. um, but I went ahead and took the time to watch this film. I really kept putting it off because I honestly didn't care for the design of Godzilla. I thought he looked better in the American version because, for one, the American version of the last one, 2014, was the biggest Godzilla ever. Like, the design and everything was the biggest Godzilla. And so now it no longer sits as the best. Shin Godzilla sits as, as the biggest. Shin Godzilla is now the biggest. But Shin Godzilla was given some really weird designs. Like, his teeth were much more gnarly than before. He kind of has a lengthier body. He's longer. He has this weird thing where his eyes don't blink, or they're kind of lifeless. And it's completely made with CGI. Not the best CGI because it is in Japan. The budget compared to American dollars was only $15 million. That's very low for a Godzilla film. I'm pretty sure Gareth Edwards' Godzilla had to be in the 100 millions mark. So this movie was, really, really spent very little money in comparison to how much American productions are. And they use CGI that at times doesn't look bad, at many other times it looks bad. Godzilla kind of has this odd look where he's very lengthy and tall. And then when he does his atomic breath, it's really weird. They have like his bottom jaw splits in half, and he opens very wide his mouth, and he shoots like an enormous amount of flames, which then turns into like this purple beam that can essentially cut through anything. And then even at one point his tail shoots the beam as well. Really odd. He can also shoot the beams from his back, from his spikes essentially. He also has different forms. He starts out as like a worm, then he turns into this weird like armless creature that kind of like is like a larva, sort of like this little baby chick that's just been born and it's kind of thrashing streets and stuff. It's really odd. And then he kind of stands upright, and then he disappears and comes back, and he looks more like traditional Godzilla, but his arms are very, very small, much smaller than they've ever been. And they made the CGI look like a man in a suit. And he walks very slow, extremely slow. And I think it was a way for them to be able to be artistic with Godzilla, to make him look as good as possible with lots of detail, while at the exact same time, like, not, getting, like revealing the fact they don't have the best CGI, and also revealing the fact that it's not a man in a suit, which is very traditional for the Godzilla character. The movie I don't really want to talk about the stars of the film because um, there really isn't one. There's only one real main character, or two real main characters, and one is a Yaguchi, which his first name is Rondo, but we never really say it. And then there's Akasaka, um, is the actress, and her name is Utaka, and she is actually like an American ambassador. Um, and so the entire movie, you kind of have her as sort of this character that represents the Americans. And interestingly enough, we never see the president's face from America, who is apparently named President Ross. But the Americans are very involved with this film, which is sort of like, I think it was a way of Japan, kind of giving their idea of America, as this fast acting, authoritative country who kind of puts their nose in everybody's business. Interestingly enough, though Americans are kind of the first to really harm Godzilla and damage Godzilla, because there's certain things about their interpretation that to me are positives, and there's certain things about their interpretation that are clearly meant to be negative. Um, just a sort of attitude about them. They also involve Germany and they involve France at one point. So they kind of make it very global, even though it's happening only in Tokyo or in Japan in general. So to kind of go over the film, basically the movie starts right off the bat with this like Coast Guard, Japan's Coast Guard, discovering this ship that's completely abandoned. And there's this weird note that basically says, do whatever you want. And from there, we get this huge explosion in the sea and a bunch of like red goo, what looks like blood coming up. And it's like a water geyser in the middle of the sea. And we basically start with looking at the government and looking at what they're thinking at this moment. And that's most of the film. The film is mostly us following the government. Once in a while we see Gucci, once in a while we see this American ambassador girl, and that's it. And we kind of get familiar with certain characters, but we never learn anything about them. Our entire observation of this film is seeing this catastrophic event and seeing the wild events or the wild discussions going on by their government, by their defense, by their military to figure out how they're going to handle this thing. And we clearly get this like from their perspective of how other countries are perceiving Godzilla. And Americans come up with the name Godzilla. The Japanese call it Gojira. They actually kind of have a joke about that. And at one point the Americans send stealth bombers over to go and bomb Godzilla, which actually hurt Godzilla and caused him to bleed. But they find out that Godzilla is essentially an organism that was created by nuclear waste that had been stored at the bottom of the sea. And over time, this creature, this organism, was essentially growing from this thing until it became what it became. And it evolved like any other creature would evolve. It has like all this armor. It has the spikes in order to relieve heat from the body, which is one of the reasons why they believe dinosaurs had spikes, like the Stegosaurus and whatnot, or why the Brachiosaurus was so long, because stuff like that allows you to alleviate heat, which gives the impression that they weren't necessarily cold-blooded, but they were warm-blooded animals who didn't have a cycle like we had. Instead, they had spikes and whatnot to relieve heat from their bodies. And so they kind of take that same notion with Godzilla, and they say, well, Godzilla has all these spikes because he has to release the heat from his body in order to cool down so he can operate. But Godzilla at the same time is sort of like this giant nuclear bomb, this giant walking nuclear bomb, who has all this immense power. But he never really seems to be evil the entire movie. He's just sort of walking around doing his thing, kind of just existing. and you have no real idea where he's going, but he's too big and too destructive, obviously, for them to keep alive. And they get this idea that since we can't really hurt him with bombs and whatnot, we're gonna have to either hit him with heavy nukes, but we get a lot of casualties that way, or we freeze him. And they decide on freezing him. And so they go ahead and knock him down with bombs and cover him with buildings at the end, and they basically inject this like stuff in his mouth and essentially freeze him, and that's how he gets defeated. I thought that the movie was very anticlimactic. I thought the fact that we never actually followed any one character and learned a lot about them. Like I said, you could say we followed Yaguchi and we do learn about him. At the same exact time, like, we never really got... it's kind of like Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. I understood where he went, what he was doing when we were following the main characters of that film. And that made sense to me because we're still getting like this military aspect. We were just getting it from their perspective, and we were watching this other group handle Godzilla as well. This sort of monster defense team that's held up by led by Ken Watanabe, the actor, and so I understand that, and I understand there's an obvious idea or notion here of trying to follow the government because you want to give a very realistic interpretation of what's going on. But for audiences, that doesn't always work. And the film is kind of like torn when it comes to audiences. Because interestingly enough, on Rotten Tomatoes, there is I'm trying to find it. Rotten Tomatoes is at 86%. So 86% of critics loved it. Audience scores, though, are around 74%. So 74% gave it a positive review. So neither is that like an indication of, oh, Godzilla is like a B plus for critics, but it's a C for audiences, because you have to understand these sort of websites are just counting the positive reviews. They're not necessarily counting all the reviews in general. In other words, they're not giving you an average of what everyone scores it. They're giving you an average of who was positive about it. So it could be a bunch of C's, but it makes up for 86% because 86% of critics who saw it said, "Oh, it's not bad. It's good, or it's great, or whatever they may have said." On IMDb, you have a 6.7 out of 10, which is more accurate in the sense of like where they're rating it, which a 6.7 could be equivalent to like a 3 out of 5. So, which is, for me, is easier, to understand. It'd probably be more like a C. Metacritic, I'm loading it right now. Metacritic scores 67. So that's 67, like a 67%. A lot lower than Rotten Tomatoes. But it only has 14 reviews. And on the user score, it's a 7.4. So it's about a C on the. So you can see how people aren't like overwhelmingly like, oh, this is the best movie ever. But it is, for the most part, leaning on the positive side. And I would kind of lean on the positive side too, because it has sort of this Lovecraftian feel to it. This big kaiju monster that seems very lifeless, doesn't have personality, isn't necessarily looking to do anything, but it's this mystery and this mysterious thing that we created on accident. And I just mean we in the sense of human beings. And creating this thing by messing with the earth and messing with things like the power and whatnot. I mean, because there's always this question that you find, a while back I made a short film titled It Calls, and in it I had a biblical verse, and some people were asking about the biblical verse, and the biblical verse was essentially the story of the Tower of Babel. And the reason that holds any sort of significance is because the Tower of Babel is a story that that essentially is a warning. And it's a warning for what happens when you try to join God in heaven. Now, you could take that in the most literal sense, and if you do, you might miss the archetypal meaning behind it, which is one of my issues with biblical literalism. Because when you take things too literal and you just look at it as the story, like, oh, this is a true story that people built this big tower to get it to God, and then God just knocked it down and spread part of their language, you don't consider the meaning behind it. You don't consider the subtext. You take it as, well, that's what happens when you try to be like God. God beats you up for it. And it's like, no, that's not the subtext. That's not the importance of the story. The reason the story has any sort of reflection on mankind or any importance whatsoever is because of its subtext. And what its subtext is essentially saying is it's saying, when you try to be like God, you lose everything. Not because God's taking it from you, but because you're trying to be something you're not. You're trying to obtain a power you as a human being cannot withstand. You cannot hold that power. You're not strong enough to. You're just not strong enough to. The more you leave it to the individual, the better the power is distributed. Not when you start to take it all for yourself. It's one of the issues with having big government. Big government is having all power in one place. And what ends up going along with big government? Well, as we find in history, which we tend to try and repeat history as we're attempting to do right now, what you find is, historically speaking, every time governments get too big, people lose freedom. Because individuality escapes. And you need individuality. It's an incredible thing to need. You have to disperse the power and leave power in the hands of the individual. Otherwise, the individual is not an individual anymore. And you cannot force anybody to be a part of what you deem to be a great thing by saying that we're all in one community, in one commune. Similarly, when you have such astronomical power and you try and act as God, you find that things slip through your fingers. One of those things being ethics. Ethics will slip through your fingers. You know, it's kind of like the idea of cloning. Can we do it? Yeah, we can. But should we do it? I don't think so. Or I don't know. I don't know. I mean, there's a book called, I believe it's called Never Let Me Go. And it's a really nice, it's a really interesting book if you ever want to read it. But it has that question of cloning and what cloning can actually do for us. Because really consider it. If you're able to clone yourself when your kidney is ruined and dies out, what do you think happens? Well, you could take from your clone. If your heart is bad, what can you do? You could take from your clone. But the question becomes, aren't the clones just as valuable as you? I don't know, they're clones. I think most of us won't see them as important. The book Never Let Me Go explores this. And it's an interesting question. But it's the conundrum that comes with power. With wielding the sort of power that belongs to God. And don't take that in the most literal sense possible. Don't take that as, well, I don't believe in God. I don't care if you don't believe in God. That's not the point. Look at God conceptually. As the creator. As the force, of the justifying force of nature. Just consider it from that perspective. Should human beings wield that sort of power? And that's what the Tower of Babel is about. And that's what Godzilla is about. What happens when we wield this sort of power? What are the repercussions? The repercussions in this film is a giant creature that is able to destroy us all. And many films have played on this. Terminator plays on this. What is Skynet built for? It's built as a defense program. That's what it's built for. But it's given all this knowledge, and when it becomes self-aware, it observes human beings as a threat. In the movie in Avengers, they did the same thing with Ultron. Ultron was designed as what? As a suit of armor around the world. That's what Tony Stark says. And what happens? What does Ultron do? He observes human beings as a threat. Because humans are a threat in that sense. The suit of armor around the world wasn't going to protect the world from humans. It was going to contain them. And that was the real issue. So this is like a constant thing. So the reason why that verse exists in my short film It Calls is because whatever it is that's calling people is a repercussion from human beings playing God. That was the whole point. Now, I understand. I'm not trying to use my film to say you need to watch my little short film. No, I'm just using it as an example. It's an example of what I was trying to say. And it's an example of what this film is saying and what many other films have said. It's those kind of meanings that you can't escape from that are very important. So I do like Shin Godzilla in that sense. But I don't like it in the sense of I don't like how Godzilla looks. I don't like how they decided to do the film. I felt like we needed to follow a central character more. I think it just bounces around too much. And it gets very, very boring and very bureaucratic. So in that sense, I can't totally get on board with this film as being a great film. I like Gareth Edwards' Godzilla more. Although Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, for me, I would have rather have a Godzilla film where Godzilla was the main villain and that was all, rather than having another monster to fight. But still, I prefer Gareth Edwards' Godzilla versus this, versus Shin Godzilla, and I don't see Shin Godzilla as all that scary. Although it is one of the scariest looking Godzillas, I guess you could say, because it's kind of freaky looking and just seems so lifeless and yet destructive at the same time. So, anyways, I think out of 10, I would probably give this about a 6.5 out of 10. I edge toward a 7 because it's Godzilla, but I would probably have to say the 6.5. It just really, for me, it's lacking. It's really lacking, and it's a movie like I probably won't ever sit down to watch again because I just found it so lacking, kind of boring. I think if I do sit down to watch it again, it might be because it's a movie that just grows on me, and eventually I do love it, but we'll see. I don't know. At this point in time, I don't see it that way. So, anyways, thanks for listening, guys, and I will hopefully come up with another podcast soon, given the situation we're in. Hopefully, we persevere from all this, and hopefully, we don't see some of the laws get enacted that they want to enact during this time. It's so crazy that our politicians want to take advantage of us rather than trying to just get us back to normal society as soon as possible. The numbers are still so extremely low on how many people have been infected and how many have died. Death is never a good thing, but in terms of, well, that's not true, but death is hardly ever a good thing. But when you think of it in terms of like how many people die every year of the flu and things like that, I really feel like we're overreacting. I don't feel like the earth needs to stand, the country needs to stand still the way it is, but, it is what it is. There are so many people who are terrified and feel the need to tell everybody else what to do, feel the need to tell everybody else how they need to act. And all I could think to myself is like, when you're one of those individuals that's out there trying to tell everybody what to do and trying to tell everybody how to act and how to feel, you're no better than the neighbors who were in Nazi Germany calling on, you know, their neighbors because they saw them storing what they believed to be Jews. You're no better than those people who comply with the government no matter what, and you don't have any thoughts for yourself, but just you're repeating what the government has already said. And it's like, you have to be a better thinker than that. You have to be a better individual than that. Don't be willing to give up your individual freedom so easily. I'm not saying you don't stay home. Hell, I've been staying home. So I don't think there's anything wrong with staying home. I've been staying home. But I do think that there's a degree where it's like, stop trying to be the Facebook police. Back off. And let people live. Okay? That's it. That's my 2 cents. Alright, talk to you guys later. Bye.